A failure in a sleeping pod on a spacecraft bound for a distant colony planet awakens one passenger 90 years early. In the distant future, humanity seeks a better existence by settling in other planet colonies. Because the travel takes decades, the passengers are placed in hibernation. The technology is completely reliable and has never failed before. On one such journey, something odd occurs that changes the traveler's future. What happens? Who is responsible for it? Will they survive? Spoiler ahead, watch out! The interstellar spaceship Avalon can be seen heading through space towards a colonized planet called Homestead 2. All of its quarters are unoccupied, and the ship is on autopilot. The 258 crew members and 5,000 passengers are in hibernation. Suddenly, the ship travels through an asteroid belt, which weakens its shields. Power is sent to the primary shield, but the ship is on a collision path with a massive asteroid. Suddenly, an asteroid collides with the ship, creating a variety of faults. The ship begins to repair itself, but one of the hibernation pods activates. Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer, was the passenger who was awakened. His pod opens, and an automatic mechanism assists him in waking up, informing him that he has been in suspended animation for 120 years, and that the vessel is just 4 months distant from Homestead 2. He is promised that he will have the capability to spend that time experiencing the ship's exquisite amenities. Prior to arriving on the planet, Jim is given instructions concerning his ID band, his cabin, and the principal activities in which he will participate. Excited and frightened to meet the people on the ship, he exits his stateroom and enters an automated classroom for an entire learning group. Jim appears concerned as the hologram describes the situation on Earth, calling it overcrowded, costly, and overdone. He gets to know that the hologram cannot respond to him and searches for other people. He arrives at the main concourse of the ship. No one is present, but an automated information desk offers assistance. Jim requests to speak with a real person, and it directs him to a steward. Yet, when he discovers that no one else is around, he requests to speak with the captain. When he arrives at the bridge, despite the fact that he is unable to enter, he notices that none of the primary crew is awake. Jim ultimately visits an observatory where he learns that the ship actually lies 90 years away from Homestead 2. He thinks he awoke too soon, so he hurries back to the terminal and sends a message to Earth, wondering what he ought to do because he has no idea how to return to hibernation. The communications technology informs him that it will take about 55 years to receive a response. Jim is upset. He walks around till he reaches the ship's bar where he meets another individual. There's something off about him that strikes the bartender during their conversation. When Jim tries to get him a drink, he finds he is an android. It's named Arthur. Jim wants to learn more from him, but he is unable to clarify to the robot how he was able to arrive ahead of schedule. Jim wakes up in his cabin the next day and walks to the cantina, where he immediately finds that the majority of the products on the menu have been reserved for gold-class guests. He gets some coffee and attempts to determine how to repair his hibernation chamber. After gathering all of the necessary gear, he successfully operates the device and lies down inside the pod, yet nothing happens. He then chooses to utilize the tools he obtained to get access to the crew's hibernation chambers. That does not work either. The android gives him some suggestions, which encourages him to sneak into one of the gold rooms and have some fun aboard the ship. Jim tries every restaurant, game, and entertainment system. However, as time passes, he finds it increasingly difficult to remain alone. He gets intoxicated one day and wanders about the sleep pods, eventually ending up in an airlock containing spacesuits designed for spacewalks. Jim puts on a suit and enters the airlock, where he presses a lever and then a button to open the door. When he steps outside the ship, he is mesmerized by the vista. He is the sole mindful human being at that point in time. Jim is quickly captivated by Aurora, a woman who lives in one of the pods. He looks for her files in the directory and listens to her passenger interview. Later, it appears sitting next to her pod, still listening to what she interviews. Back in the pub, he reads some of her work and discusses it with Arthur. He becomes preoccupied with the irony of his condition, traveling to another planet in search of a better life, getting up early but not arriving, and meeting his ideal girlfriend only to discover her beyond of reach. Jim continues to think about her and begins to consider waking her awake as well. He discusses it with the android, but he still fails to understand the situation. He walks to her pod and successfully activates it. She wakes up and undergoes the same cycle he did, and he manages to hide and returns to his room. Later, he searches for her in the main concourse. So there she is, just as perplexed as he was a year before. Jim assures her they are the only ones awake and brings her to the observatory. Then he informs her that he is unable to contact the crew or the ship's primary controls. Aurora becomes frightened and tries to return to her pod. Jim informs her that they are trapped and that there is no specific technology on the spacecraft that can assist them in going back into hibernation. They return to the hallway, and he recommends she relax because she just came out from hibernation. She feels terrible for him because he has to spend more than a year alone on the ship. Jim returns to the bar, guilty of all that he did. He requests Arthur not to inform Aurora that he is the person who woke her up. The following day, Aurora awakens. She returns to the hallway and asks the automated information desk about the hibernation pods. Jim joins her there and they go for breakfast. As they leave, the information desk experiences a problem. They discuss the prospect of fixing the pods, but Aurora, unlike Jim, is not willing to give up. She examines the infirmary, then examines research records, eventually arriving at the crew's hibernation rooms and attempting to burst the doors open. Later, Aurora regrets her existence on the Avalon. She walks to the cafeteria to interview Jim, believing that his story will be interesting. She questions why he came to the colony. Jim initially responds with company platitudes, but then goes on to say that he wishes to be someone and establish a life in the new world. They eventually get to the observatory, where Aurora finally explains why she has come. Unlike all the other passengers on board the ship, she possesses a round-trip ticket. Her plan was to travel to Homestead 2, live there for a year, and then return to Earth, becoming the first journalist to do so and write the greatest story of all time. Aurora gradually loses hope of resolving their current situation, and Jim devises a plan to cheer her up. He takes her to dance to the movie theater and to the basketball court. Finally, he accompanies her to the bar, where she meets Arthur. Following that, he's seen tinkering on something, and Aurora enters the observatory to discover a miniature of the Chrysler building he built for her. They later go on their first date at a pub. They have dinner and share personal stories about their lives. She tells him that her father died when she was a teenager. After dinner, Jim takes Aurora into the airlock, where they put on their spacesuits. The two go out on a spacewalk together. Jim now has somebody to share his lovely experience with. Jim turns off the magnets in their boots, and they float together in space. They return inside and directly kiss before retreating to his cabin and sleeping together. Soon later, they begin living as a couple. Aurora moved into his cabin and then began writing about her experiences throughout the cruise. Jim examines the ship further and discovers the hydroponics bay. One day, the ship travels by a red giant, and they decide to go to the observation. It's Aurora's birthday, so they enjoy it later that evening through all of the ship's many restaurants, followed by the bar. Jim returns to the restroom and prepares the ring he created for Aurora. And meanwhile, she remains in the bar, conversing with Arthur. The robot informs Aurora that Jim purposefully woke her up, forgetting that he was still required to keep this a secret. Jim reappears and she confronts him in complete confusion. She flees, enraged and terrified. Jim returns to his cabin to discover all of her belongings gone. He comes across her in the cantina on the following day, but the moment he talks, she moves away. Aurora is desperate. One night, she comes over to Jim's cabin and strikes and kicks him, intending to kill him. He tells her that he fell in love with her. However, Aurora doesn't seem to care about it. She cannot forgive him for taking her entire life. Another failure occurs one night while Jim is inside the cabin. The spacecraft experiences a critical error, and its main command comes to an end. Later, he enters the elevator, and it immediately malfunctions. Aurora goes into the main hallway and notices that Jim is planting a tree there. Later, when she visits the cantina, wherein the meal facility is likewise malfunctioning, suddenly they both heard the deck chief's voice, asking who grew the tree. They both rush onto the concourse and spot Gus Mancuso standing in front of the tree. They introduce themselves to each other and update the chief on the situation. Mancuso brings them to the bridge, where he determines that there is a problem with the spacecraft, but the system's information must be manually examined. Mancuso demonstrates how to collect the data. Jim joins Mancuso as he checks on the pods. He discovered what happened to Aurora's pod. The deck chief considers Jim's actions to be horrible. Later, he is at the bridge reviewing the collected data, where Aurora joins him. They discuss what happened to her pod, but he says he is unable to do anything about it. Mancuso feels the hibernating sickness and departs to rest, but when he steps out, he coughs up blood. While Aurora is swimming in the pool, all of a sudden gravity is lost throughout the ship and she drowns. The gravity drive restarts and she narrowly escapes alive. They stumble into one another on their way to find Mancuso. The three of them are now back on the bridge, slowly figuring out what has been happening with the ship. Mancuso discovers that something happened 2 years ago, destroying a major system. They need to locate and repair the issue. If they fail to repair it, everybody on the vessel will become stranded. They go to investigate the problem, but Mancuso collapses, so Jim and Aurora bring him to the infirmary. Sometime later, the three individuals meet in the observatory, and Mancuso offers Jim his ID bracelet, instructs them to fix the vessel, and then passes away. away. Suddenly, the lights turn an alarming red, and the ship starts shaking badly. Jim convinces Aurora that he requires her help, and they rush to engineering, but the gravity drive fails again. They finally arrive at engineering and begin searching for the problem. They find it in the energy plant, and as they open the hatch, Aurora and Jim are sucked in. Luckily, they quickly close the opening. Jim finds there are a number of breaches in the hull just after he fixes the problem. They follow the meteor's trajectory and discover that it has collided with the reactor management computer. Jim believes he can obtain substitute components for it. They discover and replace the part, but the reactor venting procedure continues to fail. Jim realizes he has to unlock the vent door from the exterior of the ship so they can cool off the reactor. Both of them head to the airlock, and as Jim prepares to go, he hands Aurora Mancuso's bracelet, knowing that he might not return. Aurora returns to the reactor, where temperatures have reached critical levels. A bolt from the reactor flies into her arm as Jim approaches the vent from the outside and notices the door. The level of heat in the reactor's room increases while he is attempting. He quickly realizes that he will need to manually hold the door open. The process is effective, but the fumes from the reactor push Jim away, breaking his bond. The pressure in his suit is also reducing. He informs Aurora what occurred, and she rushes to another suit and brings him in. She puts on a suit and then flies off to seek him, but her connection is too short. She takes his rope and pulls him in. Aurora drags Jim inside the infirmary, only to discover that he has already died. She uses Mancuso's wristband to bypass medical protocols and bring back him. The medical pod offers the procedure automatically and reawakens Jim. Aurora forgave him. Later, Aurora repairs Arthur, and they give Mancuso an appropriate space for burial. Jim takes her to the infirmary and informs her that he has discovered a way to use the medical pod as a sleep chamber. He tells her to get into the pod and spend the remaining time of her trip inside. But as it turns out, she declines and decides to stay alongside him awake on the vessel. Jim finally proposes to the girl, and they spend their whole lives on the vessel. 88 years later, the Avalon lands at Homestead 2. The crew awakens to discover the ship in a completely different state. Aurora sends them a message describing the story of her and Jim's lives on the vessel while the others are sleeping. We really hope you enjoyed today's recap of the movie Passengers. Please leave a comment below on what you loved about the movie and why. Be sure to like the video, and please don't forget to support our channel by subscribing so you don't miss any amazing content. Until next time, light, camera, action. We look forward to seeing you in our next video.